People think preferring to be alone is a sign of something gone wrong, a wound, a door that closed somewhere in childhood and never opened again. We call it antisocial. We call it lonely. We assume that anyone who chooses solitude over a crowded room must be hiding from something, or running from someone, or quietly breaking down where nobody can see. Psychology disagrees completely. Some of the most balanced, most self-aware, most emotionally intelligent people alive prefer their own company to almost anyone else's. They always have. So, why do we treat that preference like a symptom? That answer will surprise you. We live in a culture that treats company as proof of worth. Fill the calendar, answer the phone, say yes to the invitation. A full social life is held up as the mark of a healthy person, and an empty Friday night is treated like a confession of failure. We measure people by how many friends they have, how many parties they attend, how rarely they are seen by themselves. And the person who turns down the gathering, who leaves early, who feels something loosen in their chest the moment they close their own front door, that person gets asked if everything is okay. But here is what psychology has quietly uncovered. People who prefer being alone are often not damaged. They are not running. They are not afraid of people. They're wired differently. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the hidden psychology of people who prefer being alone. What drives it? What it reveals about the mind underneath? And why most of us have been misreading it our entire lives. Think about the first time someone made you feel strange for wanting to be by yourself. You probably weren't an adult. You were a child. Maybe you slipped away from the birthday party to sit alone in a quiet room, and a grown-up found you and asked, with real concern, why aren't you playing with the others? Maybe you came home from school content to spend the whole afternoon with a book or a window, and someone said, you should call a friend. It isn't healthy to be alone so much. Maybe a report card came back glowing in every subject, except the one line that said, does not socialize enough, prefers to work independently, as if that were a flaw to be corrected. The words were small. The lesson was not. You learned very early that the thing that calmed you, the instinct to retreat inward and refill, was something other people found worrying. So you started apologizing for it. You learned to manufacture reasons, to say you were tired, to pretend you had other plans, because the real reason that you simply wanted to be alone sounded like something was wrong with you. That message didn't just fade away. It got wired in, and for many people, it never left. They grew up, built lives, kept jobs, and they still feel a flicker of guilt every single time they choose the quiet over the crowd. Psychologist Dr. Hans Eysenck spent his career studying the biology underneath personality, and he proposed something that reframes this entire conversation. He argued that introverts and extroverts differ in their baseline level of cortical arousal, the constant hum of activity in the brain. Extroverts, he suggested, run slightly under-aroused, so they seek out noise, people, and stimulation to feel awake. Introverts run closer to the top already. Their inner world is busy enough on its own, so a loud room doesn't energize them. It floods them. This isn't a preference they invented to avoid people. It is a nervous system that reaches its comfortable capacity faster, and that needs solitude the way an overfull glass needs to stop being poured. When someone who prefers being alone says a party left them drained, they are not being dramatic. They are describing a brain that was already running near the line before they walked in the door. Here's something most people never consider. Solitude is not the absence of activity. For these minds, it is where the most important activity happens. Neuroscientist Dr. Marcus Reichel discovered a system in the brain called the default mode network. It's the network that switches on when you stop engaging with the outside world. Sitting alone, walking with no destination, staring at the ceiling while the day settles. While the social brain goes quiet, this network goes to work, integrating memories, processing emotions, stitching scattered experiences into something that finally makes sense. People who seek out solitude are giving this network the room it needs to finish its work. That's not idleness. That is the mind digesting a life. If you have ever felt scattered after days of constant company and then felt yourself click back into focus the moment you were finally alone, understand what is actually happening. You weren't avoiding people. You were returning to the only place where your mind could process them. There's a specific kind of clarity that almost nobody talks about. Time alone gives you something a crowded life rarely can. The chance to hear your own thoughts without anyone else's voice mixed in. Psychologists have studied this directly. Researchers, including Dr. Kenan Sheldon and Dr. Richard Ryan, working from self-determination theory, distinguish between loneliness, which is solitude you didn't choose and don't want, and the kind of solitude a person seeks out on purpose. Chosen solitude turns out to be linked with stronger self-knowledge, better emotional regulation, and a clearer sense of who you actually are underneath everyone else's expectations. Being alone has a terrible reputation. We treat it like a holding cell, a place you only end up when nobody wants you. But for people who prefer it, it is the opposite. It is the one room where they can finally take off the version of themselves they wear for the world and remember who is underneath. And then there's the quality of what they offer when they do show up. You might assume someone who guards their alone time keeps everyone at a distance. Look closer, and the opposite is usually true. Because they spend less of themselves on the wide, shallow end of social life, they have more to give in the deep end. They don't do small talk well, and they rarely pretend to. What they do instead is pay complete attention to the few people who matter. Psychologists describe a real difference between a large network of weak ties and a small circle of strong ones, and people who prefer solitude almost always invest in the second. They remember what you told them. They follow up on the thing you mentioned in passing. They show up for the conversation that actually matters and skip the 100 that don't. That isn't coldness wearing the wrong label. That is a person who refuses to spread their care so thin that none of it lands anywhere. But that kind of life, it comes at a price, and it creates something quietly exhausting that almost nobody talks about. The person who prefers being alone is constantly managing a world built for the opposite. Every unanswered invitation has to be explained. Every early exit gets noticed. Every quiet weekend invites a worried question from someone who means well and still doesn't understand. Psychologists have documented how much energy it takes to mask, to perform a sociability you don't naturally feel, to keep smiling through the third hour of a gathering when your whole system is begging to go home. People who prefer solitude often spend years doing exactly that, pushing past their own limits to seem normal, and paying for it later in a fatigue that sleep doesn't quite fix. They come home from the event not just tired, but hollowed out, because they didn't only attend it, they performed through it. And the cruel part is that the very recovery they need, the quiet, the closed door, the empty afternoon, is the thing the world keeps telling them to feel guilty about. They are made to apologize for the one medicine that actually works on them. Now here's where the science turns surprising. The capacity to be alone is not a retreat from maturity. It is one of its highest signs. The psychoanalyst Dr. Donald Winnicott wrote a now famous paper called The Capacity to Be Alone, and he argued something that sounds backwards until you sit with it. The ability to be comfortably, contentedly alone, he said, is not a sign of detachment. It is a sign of deep emotional security. A child only learns to play happily by themselves when they feel safe enough, held enough, that they no longer need someone hovering to feel okay. The adult who can sit alone without anxiety is the adult who carries that security inside them. And there is more. Researchers studying creativity have found again and again that solitude is where original thinking is born. The space to follow a thought without interruption, to wander, to make connections nobody hands you in a meeting. That space requires being alone. The person who chooses solitude isn't withdrawing from life. They are protecting the conditions under which their best thinking and their steadiest self can actually exist. Here's the part that gets almost no airtime. People who prefer being alone are often exceptional in ways our culture never bothers to name. They are comfortable in their own company, which means they rarely cling, rarely panic, rarely stay in the wrong room just to avoid being by themselves. They make decisions from their own center instead of from the pressure of the crowd. They can tell the difference between being lonely and being alone, and that one distinction frees them from 1,000 bad choices other people make just to avoid an empty evening. They tend to know themselves with a depth that startles people because they have actually spent time listening. And in relationships, this becomes something close to a quiet superpower. They don't come to others out of desperation or fear of solitude. They come because they choose to, which means the people they let in are wanted for themselves, not used as a cure for an empty room. That isn't weakness wearing the wrong label. That is a form of self-possession, a form of emotional independence that most people quietly wish they had. So, here's the question worth sitting with. What if the person who seems most alone isn't the one who's lost something? What if they're the one who found something the rest of us keep drowning out? What if preferring solitude isn't the opposite of connection? What if it is the foundation of it, the only ground deep enough for real connection to grow, because you cannot truly meet another person until you have learned to sit, unafraid, with yourself? People who prefer being alone have been misread for most of their lives, labeled as antisocial, told they're too withdrawn, too distant, too hard to reach, asked again and again if something is wrong, made to feel like a preference that brings them peace is somehow a problem to be solved. But psychology tells a different story. Preferring solitude often means a nervous system that reaches its limits sooner and knows how to refill. It means a default mode network given the space to turn experience into understanding. It means chosen solitude that builds self-knowledge instead of loneliness that erodes it. It means the deep emotional security to be content in your own company and the rare honesty to offer your real attention only where it counts. If you have spent years being told you are too distant, too quiet, too content on your own, hear this clearly. The trait you were taught to apologize for may be the most grounded thing about you. That's not something to hide. That's something to understand. If this video changed the way you see people who prefer being alone, even just a little, subscribe for more psychology insights that reveal what most of us never stop to notice. And drop a comment below. Do you think preferring to be alone is a weakness or a hidden strength? We read every answer because chances are you didn't just watch this video, you watched it alone, and somewhere in the quiet, you finally felt understood.